Welcome to the Social Engineer Podcast, the Human Element Series. This is episode 178. I'm Chris Hadnagy, founder and CEO of Social Engineer LLC, social-engineer.org, and the Innocent Lives Foundation. And I've been hosting this podcast for a very long time, 2009. Can you believe that? It's a long time to be doing a podcast. I know. This episode is sponsored by the company, social-engineer.com. We are focused solely on human-based vectors. And we know we can just open up any newspaper, any news article. You're seeing ransomware all over the planet, phishing, vishing through the roof. Everything's just kind of really creating problems for us right now when it comes to these type of vectors. So our focus is understanding how these things happen. What kind of human-based decision-making do we have that creates this vulnerability for us? And how can we make ourselves more secure? Part of that is this podcast, talking to people like our guest today, where we get to learn a little bit about different parts of psychology that can maybe keep you and myself and all of us a little bit safer. You can check things out on social-engineer.com to find out more. If you like the topic of social engineering, you can hop on over to our Slack channel. We have over 1,100 people in there now talking about everything from the psychology behind social engineering to actually people who do phishing and vishing for a living. People who are looking for jobs. We've had 8 people find different employment there on the forum. So you can check out the link in the show notes and join us on the Slack channel there. Also, if you're looking for a specialized course that immerses you in the world of social engineering, you should check out our website. Go to social-engineer.com and go to the training tab. You'll see all the dates for OSINT, for our social engineering risk assessment course, as well as the flagship APSE course. There's one coming up right in August here in Orlando. You can check out the dates for those, and we'll be adding more dates coming up in the future. So just keep checking that out because those things seem to fill up fast. Huge shout out to Clutch. If you don't know them, you're listening to them at the beginning of the show. That's the music for the intro. Check them out at pro-rock.com. Of course, I'm a huge fan, but also Neil is on the board of the Innocent Lives Foundation, and he just really brings it home with the music that they let us use here on the podcast, which brings me to my last announcement, which is about the ILF. Please go out and check out the work that we're doing there. InnocentLivesFoundation.org. My team has worked so hard. We're up to over 600 cases that we've worked now, helping law enforcement track people who traffic children and create child abuse material. And I'm just really proud of my team there that we've been able to help law enforcement locate people all over the globe who are hurting kids and stop those crimes. And we do so ethically, morally, and legally, right? And some people ask, are you hacking them? Nope, not at all. We're just using our powers of knowing OSINT and social engineering to help geolocate people who are hurting kids and turning them into law enforcement so they can then be apprehended, taken care of properly. So I'm just so proud of the work there. So just go check it out, InnocentLivesFoundation.org. Now, I'm really excited. Let's talk about our guest today, because this is a topic that we've talked about on the podcast a lot, but it's Dr. Ronald Riggio. He's here from Henry R. Kravis Professor of Leadership and Organizational Psychology. I didn't even know there was such a thing as leadership and organizational psychology, so I'm learning something new every day. He was the former director of the Kravis Leadership Institute at Claremont McKenna College. Dr. Riggio is a social and personality psychologist and a leadership scholar. Again, learning all these things I didn't even know existed as actual degrees, with more than a dozen authorized or edited books and more than 150 articles. So we're going to learn a lot today about this topic. His research interests are in leadership, organizational communication, particularly leadership nonverbal communication, and emotional competence. And you know anything, if you listen to this podcast at all, this is something I am deeply in love with. He's part of the Fullerton Longitudinal Study that is examining leadership development across the lifespan, beginning at 1 year of age and then continuing all the way through adulthood. So guarantee we're going to have some great conversation. Ronald, it's great to have you here with us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, Chris.
So an impressive, resume, if we start with this. I mean, how did you get started in this? Like, how did this even become something you said, I'm going to focus my whole life on this?
Yeah, it's kind of, there's no direct path in most people's careers, right? So I started out as a social psychologist, social personality psychologist, and I was interested actually in nonverbal communication, and that's what I did my graduate work in. And for the first dozen or so years of my career, that's what I was looking at, was nonverbal communication. And I know you have a connection to Paul Ekman, to Dr. Ekman. And my first job was at UC San Francisco, and so I got to work with Paul Ekman. But one of the things that I was really interested in in the area of nonverbal communication was individual differences in people's ability to communicate nonverbally. And so I worked out of the Ekman group, I worked with Maureen O'Sullivan, who was also interested in those individual differences. And you might, Maureen's work was on the wizards of deception with Paul. So, and what I was doing was I was looking at, for example, with my mentor, Howard Friedman, we were looking at individuals who were really good at expressing their emotions, expressing themselves nonverbally. And at one point, Howard Friedman said to me, I think we're stumbling onto what people think of as charisma. And, I'm a very serious graduate student at that point in time. And so I'm thinking, well, charisma is kind of a pop psychology term. That's not something that's legitimate to study. But I thought, well, I'll go see what's out there in the area of charisma. And that, of course, leads me to early sociological work like Max Weber. But the people who were studying charisma were all leadership scholars, and they were looking at charismatic leadership. And so at the time, I wasn't particularly interested in leadership, but as we started studying these very expressive people, and we started calling it personal charisma, I noticed a couple things. First, they weren't just good at sending emotions, they were also better at receiving emotions and emotional and nonverbal messages. And they were better at controlling and regulating those emotional messages. And so that then sort of developed into this idea of personal charisma, people who are really skilled and effective communicators. But we went beyond just the nonverbal and started looking at verbal communication too. And so that led to this kind of approach to look at individual differences in communication skill more generally. And if you think about leaders, then segueing into leadership, leaders are really, for the most part, the really best leaders are brilliant and effective communicators. They're able to motivate and inspire people. They can focus on the individual they're interacting with, make them feel comfortable, all those kinds of things. So they're really skilled, what we might call charismatic leaders, had all of those. So that's what kind of led me down this long path into leadership.
What year was that when you started saying, let's look at charisma? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it was actually the early 1980s.
Wow.
And so actually the first book that I wrote was called, now this is interesting, it was called Charisma, and then I did it with a trade publisher, and they thought that wasn't a good enough title to just say charisma. So they called it the Charisma Quotient, which, as a serious psychologist, that kind of bothered me a little bit, because quotient assumes intelligence, IQ, and that's kind of sacred in psychology. And so if you then fast forward a few years, you get into emotional intelligence, the emergence of emotional intelligence. So I published the Charisma Quotient in 1987. 1990 was the first Salovey and Mayer article where they used the term emotional intelligence. And then, of course, Daniel Goleman comes in and writes, and so essentially what we were doing was we were looking at what is a big part of emotional intelligence, but it's those individual differences in emotional and nonverbal and verbal skill. And so I still don't like using the term emotional intelligence. I like to use the term emotional skill.
It's interesting because when I think about that whole phraseology, it seems relatively new. But here you're saying in the 80s, you were starting to look into this and seeing a connection between leadership and their people who are leaders having the ability to use this emotional skill.
Yeah, and you see this. I mean, if you think about, leaders who get the charisma label, right? So we think about John F. Kennedy, right? JFK. And, he was a really good speaker, but part of it, if you watch any of his public speeches, the more informal ones. Like the one I often show in class is the one where he talks about we're going to land a man on the moon. And he's talking at, I believe it's Rice University, and he's in the football stadium, right? But he uses humor well. He connects with the audience, even though there's, probably 50,000 people in the audience. And so you see those individual differences, those really highly developed skills in communicating. I ran into somebody who met Bill Clinton, and I heard this about JFK too, but they said this. It was like I was the only person in the room. He and I were the only ones in the room. And so that ability to connect with people. Actually, in communication, they often call that immediacy or nonverbal immediacy, that you have that sort of connection.
That's fascinating to me. I also met somebody who had interacted with President Clinton, and they said the same thing, that he would meet you and he would pick out something, like maybe a pin that you were wearing or something about your jewelry or your person or clothing. And then when he would shake your hand, he would talk about it. Like he said the woman he was with had this pin about a dog. And he said, "Is that like a collie? I love collies." And it was something that all of a sudden, you may be with 100,000 people in this room, but you are the only two humans that exist right now.
Yeah.
And I always found that fascinating.
Yeah, and I've actually heard that exact same story, but it wasn't a pin of a dog. It was something else about him. But you also see, and I think one of the things that got missed in kind of the nonverbal emotional intelligence work is how much verbal communication comes into play, and that sort of knowing what to do in particular circumstances. Mm-hmm. And so you saw that idea of, and probably that was something that President Clinton developed. He learned that was a good way to connect people. You know how we sometimes forget names and things, but he might not forget the dog pin. Mm-hmm. And so it's a device. And I think that really skilled communicators use these sorts of devices that they develop. The other thing that I think is really important and gets overlooked, and there's a lot of work on emotional regulation, but this ability to regulate, to sort of turn it on and turn it off. And I've seen this in a number of politicians, is that when you sort of meet them backstage, so to speak, they're sort of bland, a little bit bland. But once they hit that stage, they just sort of turn it on. They turn on the charm, so to speak. And so I think that ability to regulate and control it is really important too.
So let's say I'm not that. I'm not Clinton. I'm not JFK. I'm not one of these people. So how can I be? How can I learn that?
Well, I mean, it's not easy. That's the one thing. And you know this, being an expert in social engineering and in nonverbal communication. It's not easy. It really takes a lot of hard work and a lot of dedication. I have a colleague. In fact, his office is right next door to mine. Jay Conger, and he wrote a lot about charismatic leadership. And he told his students, he didn't tell me this, but he's very good at gesturing while he speaks. He's a terrific presenter. He's highly sought after as a leadership scholar and speaker. But he told his students it took him a year to work on his gestures to get them just right. And when you watch him speak, you can almost just get fascinated by his hands, by his handwork, right?
So he actively said, "I want to improve this," and then he worked out a plan, and he spent a year getting it so it was a natural thing.
Yeah, just gestures, right, and not the rest of it. So it really does take a lot of time. We did. I worked with a graduate student who did her dissertation on. We called it developing personal charisma. So we put out a ad on the campus. This was the University of California. And so students came, and we had them commit to 6 weeks of training. And in that training, they came for the 6 weeks. They came twice a week for a couple hours. We ran them through exercises. We gave them feedback and all of that. And at the end of 6 weeks, there was improvement, right? I mean, there were, but it was sort of interesting. And at that time, one of the TV shows, I don't know if it was 2020 or 60 Minutes, they were thinking about doing a show on this because we had talked about this and published some of it. And they brought the cameras and they had us, do another round of training. And they had the cameras going, but the training was so slow. And they go, "This is really boring. This is not good." So it never aired, because it's like watching somebody practice, right? I mean, and so there was nothing all that interesting about it. But we did do some before and after videotaping, and you can see positive change from the before to the after.
I always found that I love that answer because people ask me that question, and I'm a very direct communicator, and I run a couple of companies, and my normal, let's say, gestures would be like this, right? And I learned that these open ventrals are so much more inviting. And it took me probably longer than a year, but it took me actually literally in notes when I would give speeches, putting reminders, open ventral. And eventually I would just put OV. And I would have these notes throughout my columns, OV, just to remind myself to stop doing this and to just turn it over. And I remember the first few times it almost felt like I was breaking my arm to do this twist, but eventually it became, now that it is natural for me to gesture palms up as opposed to palms down. This almost feels unnatural now, but that did take years of practice to do that.
Yeah, and I'm sure politicians, whether they do it formally, but I'm sure that a lot of politicians get, advisors, people to work with them on this, and you see a lot of those. I mean, one of the ones that's very common, and actually this one I associate a lot with Bill Clinton, but I saw JFK do it too. It's called the baton gesture, and it's that kind of the open fist. And the reality is, you can't use the pointing finger because it looks accusatory. And so the baton gesture it looks like you're holding a baton, and you can use it to punctuate your statements, right? And that's something that is learned. That's not a natural gesture. It looks like you're conducting an orchestra. I mean, that's just not.
I always found that one funny because I think after JFK and Clinton made that so popular, so many politicians tried it. And not to like cut anyone, but I won't even say a name. There was one politician, every time she tried it, she would shrug her shoulder. And I remember thinking, oh no, like you're doing that wrong. Like, you're using the baton, but then you're kind of saying, I'm not really confident with that. And it was almost like this weird thing. So people tried saying, wow, I really like when I see Clinton do that. Like, that makes me feel like he's not pointing at me, but then doing it wrong can almost have the negative effect. Have you found that with a lot of nonverbals to be the case?
Yeah, and a good example of that, actually, I guess it was Richard Nixon. Is I think that after, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm imagining that after the 1960 debates, where he did not perform very well, that he got some feedback and maybe some formal training. But I watched a couple of speeches of Nixon where he was going to pound on the table for emphasis, and he sort of made the point. And then there was that delay, and it wasn't right on cue, So I think that, it is really hard to learn. I'm going to mention something because I know you've studied micro expressions in the Ekman model. And one of the things that, and actually this happened in class because I was doing a seminar on nonverbal communication. One of my students was going to talk about Ronald Reagan, President Reagan's charisma, because he was often called charismatic. And so he had a speech of Reagan up on the video monitor. And every once in a while, he would hit the pause button, and he was to talk a little more about Reagan, and then he would show a little more of the clip. But what was interesting is every time you hit the pause button, you would see a still, picture of Reagan's face. And if you were Ekman trained, you would say, "Oh my gosh, that looks like surprise." And then a little while later, he'd stop it again, and you go, "Boy, that's a clear, happy face," And what I think, and we weren't able to really capture this, but I think that what we're getting at is, I call it emotional lability, is some people have this ability in their sort of natural expressions to really just show a lot of emotional expressions. And I think that's part of what makes that person seem attractive, lively. And we haven't done it so much with micro expressions because they're really hard to measure. But we've done it with just changes in facial expressions. So we say, anytime, watch this videotape, anytime you see a clear change in the person's facial expression, just count it. We use a counter. And what we found was that those changes in facial expressions actually predicted other people's rating of how charismatic the individual was. So I would imagine
that macro expressions would lead more to charisma because it's so much easier for people to see, especially like you said, that the positives of surprise and happiness make people feel like you're more human than just being so stoic.
And obviously, I mean, when we think about, so I've asked people, who are charismatic individuals and who are non-charismatic individuals, and they come up with some public figures, and I don't want to mention the non-charismatic names, but what you see in those non-charismatic individuals is not a lot of emotional expression. They're very, very sort of deadpan, And I mean, if you think back, I mean, there's a comedian, Stephen Wright, who basically delivers this absurd stuff with a straight face. And if you go back to silent pictures, then Buster Keaton, who always had a stone face, and while everything crazy is happening around them. So and when you see that, it's sort of out of context. The person seems sort of robotic or non-human. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, the more expressive individuals are, then I think, and we know this, we have lots of research, lots of published research that show that expressive people are better liked. They're actually seen as more attractive too. So in one study, the title of the study is Beauty is More Than Skin Deep. And we talked about components of attractiveness. And we found that sure, whether you're beautiful or handsome, you have a nice face, a nice body, that kind of thing. Sure, that's important. But we controlled for that. And we found what we call dynamic attractiveness. And that's the way the person carries themselves, and the Beatles song, the George Harrison song, something in the way she moves or something in the way he moves. And so we think that those are elements of this sort of underlying emotional skill, emotional intelligence, whatever you want to call it. I will use the term emotional intelligence, but it's the issue with emotional intelligence is it's correlated with actual verbal intelligence, with IQ. And so we know that. So they're probably not separate intelligences. They're probably different versions of this broader construct of intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, I've met people that I've never tested them, but probably have huge IQs, genius level. But from an emotional standpoint, I'd rather talk to a chair. But then I've met people who may not be the brightest, but wow, like they're active listeners. They connect with you. You just feel like you are the center of the universe when you're with them.
Yeah. And there are a lot of people. And so this is where we get into kind of like what we might call street smarts, sort of that intelligence that's picked up by people who don't have any not much formal education, but they sort of learned how to interact with people, learn how to influence them, in some cases manipulate them. And then we get into the sort of, the kind of con artists that are out there that can manipulate people.
So let's say someone's listening to this and they're like, I want to be a better leader. I want to develop becoming a leader. What are some steps they can take to start on that path? Yeah.
So the first thing, really, and developing leadership, we just talked about how hard it is to develop nonverbal skill and communication skill. Well, it's much harder to develop leadership because communication skill is an important component of that, but it's only one component, right? So you've got to develop relationship skills because more and more leadership is very relationship based, right? So when you ask people, why they left their jobs, 7 out of 10 times they didn't leave their jobs. They left their bosses. They left the people that they report to, who they felt didn't get them, didn't understand them, didn't care about them, whatever. So relationship skills are important. But starting at the beginning, you got to realize this is going to be hard work. You've got to really work at it. You need to think about why you want to be a leader. And you have to develop a kind of a mindset, a leader's mindset. That's one of the starting points. You have to say, I want to be a leader. I want to be a good leader. And then you have to define that. What do I mean by good? What's my sort of implicit model of what a good leader should look like? And then that will allow you to then set out the roadmap for the skills that you need to develop. And a lot of that too would be, one element of a kind of leadership development would be looking at leaders that you admire and studying them, just like we did with the charismatic presidents. They work on the gestures, work on speech, and then, and it's not just the nonverbal elements, the body language elements. It's also learning how other people think, learning what kind of makes them tick, because you have to respond to that. And much more, the very best leaders are follower centric. They're focused on the people that they lead. And you don't lead alone. One of the things I would say, leadership is not something leaders do. Leadership is co-created by leaders and followers working together. And if you don't have the followers on board as a leader, and if they don't trust you, want to follow you, want to do what you're asking them to do, you're not going to be a very strong leader.
I like that. I like that point because it seems so logical, but until you said it, it's almost like one of those light bulb moments. Like, yeah, you could think you're a great leader, but if you have no followers, then who are you leading?
Yeah, that's right. And realize that you can't do leadership alone, right? I mean, you have to have the other people. And so if you talk about motivating people, you can use. So I've done some work with a couple of people, James McGregor Burns and Bernard Bass. And they both have worked in the area of what we call transforming or transformational leadership. And so part of the idea of transformational leadership is you've got to inspire and motivate people. And you can't do that in a sort of a transactional way. So transformational leadership goes beyond mere transaction. So transactional leadership is, I want you to work for me. I'm going to pay you a lot of money. Do what I say. And that works. I mean, that'll work if you can have the resources to give the person to satisfy their needs. But transformational leadership goes well beyond that. You're going to get performance way beyond what you might expect with just transactional leadership. And actually, Bernie Bass's book was called Leadership and Performance Beyond Expectations. Because in studying transformational leaders, he found that those leaders led teams that actually exceeded what you might expect. But the way they inspire and motivate people is they align what they're doing, their purpose, the leader's purpose, the organization's purpose, with the values, the needs of the followers, right? And so by aligning that, you're going to motivate people. But you've got to address what they want, what's going to motivate them.
And that's that's a really interesting point, because if you break that down, that means that the leader needs to spend time getting to know the people that they're leading. Otherwise, how do you know what their values, morals, and wants are in life?
Absolutely. And that's why transformational leadership actually subsumes charisma. It includes charisma. And that's why if you look at followers of transformational leaders, they will say, I love my leader. And if you ask them, is your leader charismatic? Of course, Mm-hmm. Now you and I might watch that person and go, I don't see a lot of charisma there. But they do because of that connection. It's like when the politician looks right at you, the rest of the crowd isn't spellbound by that individual's charisma, but when they're looking right at you. And so that's kind of what the leader does. They develop that really good relationship with each individual follower, and that then motivates the whole team.
Now, how does an effective leader do that? Let's say if your team is huge, like these companies, like Tesla or somebody has thousands upon thousands of employees. I mean, my team is small. I have 15 people, 16 people that work for me. That's easy to get to know each one of them. But if my team was 500 people, that would be so hard to do that.
Yeah, well, I think now then you get into mass communication, right? So if we think back to the late Steve Jobs, and if I asked you to imagine Steve Jobs talking to Apple, well, we saw it because when those new product releases where he would be on the stage. In fact, there's a little icon, a little emoticon kind of thing, emoji of Steve Jobs, because he always wore a turtleneck, and so they have. I mean, they actually have a Steve Jobs little icon, and that was him communicating to the masses of employees at Apple, and and he did it with not just with his own personal communication, but with great slides and videos and lights and cameras and action, right, and all of that, and so. I think when you're talking about leading at the top in an organization like that, you have to think about things about like, how am I going to communicate to the rank and file people? And so usually when you see these very effective transformational leaders, they may write a little sort of internal newsletter or blog, or they take the time to personalize emails to individuals, just like you suggested with President Clinton. They remember the pin, they remember something about that person, and they personalize it. And all of that builds a really, really strong relationship and a strong support for the leader.
That's interesting. I like that idea. I'd never even heard of that before, like something like an internal newsletter, internal blog, or something that is just for your team that shows this personal interest in them as a group. Because I could see, like Steve Jobs is a great example. Yeah. I almost imagine I had a chance to do a little work with Apple, and their internal communications are so strong. They're so strong within there. You can almost see that, but that came from the top down. The way that they communicate, and people felt empowered in that company to express themselves, to be themselves there. Yeah. That's interesting.
I once met a CEO just shortly after he retired. And actually we were giving him an award as a transformational leader. We were trying to promote the idea of transformational leadership. And it was really interesting because he was giving a talk about, how he got to where he was and his vision for the organization. And though his team, who were now going to take over, I was sitting with them at the table, and they were in tears, because they said to me, we don't know what we're going to do without him, And after he spoke, I talked to him and I said, boy, they're really concerned about you leaving. And he goes, they are going to do so much better than I ever did. I sort of had to feel my way. And he says, I know they're going to perform better than me. And I said, why? How do you know that? He goes, because I developed them. And so that's the second element of transformational leadership. So not only do transformational leaders lead teams to levels beyond expectations, levels of performance beyond expectations, they also develop their followers' leadership capacity. Because if you're leading through the followers, that means you're empowering, you're delegating work to them, and their leadership capacity grows. And so just like this CEO, he said, I know they're better trained than I ever was when I got into this position, because he intentionally made sure they were developed.
That's a really valuable point. I think a lot of times what I've experienced and seen in different careers is that the people who lead you don't want to be replaced. So they don't ever take you to that top rung. They always leave a little bit of the special sauce out. And a really good leader is one who was like, you're going to take my job so I can go do something else. Right.
And that, I think, is that sort of highest level of good leadership. It's where the sort of transformational, charismatic leader becomes the really, truly great leader, is they have that humility to say, it's not all about me. It's about the purpose, the organization. It's about the people I lead. And so they're not threatened by the idea that someone is going to outperform them, one of their successors. And just like, and I often use the analogy of parenting, the same way a parent wants better things for their children, a great leader wants, great things from their followers. They want them to continue to perform. But sort of a narcissistic leader, or a self-centered leader is going to say, no, it's all about me. And they're going to feel threatened by their followers as they, rise up in terms of their own leadership. And so a really great leader has that humility to say, I don't know it all. I can't do it all. And my gosh, if the people I developed can perform better than me, I'm happy.
You know what I always love about conversations like this? It's like media oftentimes paints powerful people as these like almost ruthless, tough, like the superheroes are all this, like just gonna beat you up if you're in my way kind of thing. And yet here we are talking about true leaders, and you're using words like compassion, you're using words like humility, you're using words like empathy. And I think if any of us were to sit back and think about just a person who we felt was a great leader for us or a great mentor or anything, they would have all of those words as part of their descriptions. And it wouldn't be a ruthless, strong-willed person that you would think of.
Yeah. It's interesting. And I'll tell you about a study that we just did, and I'm going to extrapolate a lot from what our findings were. But one of the things that has been found is that most people do want the kind of leader that you just spoke about, has empathy, has compassion, cares about me, and all that. But there's a pretty consistent finding that a subset of the population, roughly about 30%, want and are attracted to strongman leaders, right? Those, sort of self-centered, my way or the highway, sometimes punitive, authoritarian leaders. And what we did, you had mentioned our longitudinal study. We looked at our folks and we asked them, okay, what are some of the qualities you admire in leaders? And most of them, 70% of them, said the kinds of things we want: somebody who's empathic and has competence and compassion and cares about us but can get the job done, is a good spokesperson for our organization, all those kinds of things. But about a third of them said, I want somebody who's tough, who, doesn't, doesn't take prisoners, that kind of thing. So we found that. Well, we went back and we looked at what happened to those people, now adults, they're 38 years. We went back because we had data on them growing up as children, right? And what we found was that in general, those who supported those sort of strong man leaders, and I keep using the strong man, but it could be women too. We actually use the term tyrants because the measure sort of measures that, but they like tyrannical leaders. Well, we went back and we looked at what happened in their past, and a lot of them grew up in very high conflict families. Okay. So now I'm playing this out because I'm going well beyond our data, but imagine this. You grew up in a high conflict family. Everybody's yelling at everyone. Nobody's paying attention or whatever. How does the parent get control? They start to yell, scream, and they maybe knock a few heads around. Okay. And that's the kind of level of conflict we found in when we look back. Think about that. Well, it probably worked. And so their prototype of an effective leader is somebody who, is like a bully who can stop the bad guy. And now there's a lot of that in our sort of popular culture, right? There's the, way back, Charles Bronson used to play a character like that. And Liam Neeson more recently, the bad guys, I'm a good guy, but when push comes to shove, he's badder than the bad guys.
Yes, right? The ends justify the means.
That's right. And you just, Chris, you just hit it on the head. if the ends justify the means, then you worry about the sort of moral compass of that leader.
Yeah.
Right. And so very often when you see those strong person leaders, and very often those kinds of leaders are high on things like narcissism, but it's really all about them, the power and control that they have. And then you get the Vladimir Putins,
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I would not, that's interesting. I can't wait to read that study, because I would not have thought that there would be people out there who would say, yeah, I want a leader who's, going to bash some heads.
Some of the leadership scholars that first found that before that was ever a published result, we were at a conference meeting, and they started telling that to us, and everyone around the table said, that can't be. How can it? They said, we keep doing it. It's always 30%. It's always roughly 30% who like that, right?
I mean, it makes sense from what you said. Like, if you were raised that way, and as disturbing as it is, that's your comfort zone. Man, things got done when Dad came in and pulled that belt out. Yeah. Then that's your example. So now you own a company, and people aren't listening, and you're like, nope, I'm going to have to start beating people to get stuff done.
I mean, go back a few generations, and sayings like "spare the rod and spoil the child," right. And corporal punishment was, common. I mean, gosh, when I grew up in went to a private school, and they called it the Board of Education. Bend over and take it. So things have changed, and so I would say probably if we went back in time and we asked people in the early 20th century, we would probably get way more than 30% saying those are the great kind of leaders. I want the strong man leader.
Yeah, I would imagine that. I mean, I'm only in my 40s, but I grew up in a public school where paddling was allowed.
Yeah.
So if you mouthed off to the teacher, she pulled you out in the hallway. You had to grab your ankles, and they were allowed to hit you.
Yeah. No,
I can't imagine that today. I mean, some teacher puts his hands on my kid, there's going to be problems, right?
Yeah. But see, we've changed. And so in the same way that we've changed, and I think that parenting is a good analogy for leadership, because in the same way that a parent wants to develop their kids and turn them into better kids, a really good parent, a really good leader wants to develop their followers and have a succession and have them do great things and takes pride in their accomplishments.
Yeah.
And so it's a great analogy for thinking about leaders. And we have changed in the same way that parenting, what was acceptable for parents to do, 50 years ago is not acceptable now. In leaders, although there are still many leaders who are practicing, that kind of punitive style. We know punishment doesn't. I mean, from basic psychology, we know punishment is not a very good motivational strategy, because all it does is it gets you from, it gets you to learn how to not get caught, right?
Yeah, I think I was thinking of something very similar when you were saying that, is that, and even as a parent, we learned. I grew up in a time too where parents, corporal punishment was the nature of the day. But, I learned as a father that doesn't get happy compliance. It may get peace and quiet for a moment, but later on you don't have a great relationship. So if you want a good relationship that lasts for the life of your kids, you change the method of discipline.
Yeah.
To be more corrective than it is punitive.
Yeah. And I mean, part of this is it's hard for us to think about, parents who have that sort of old model or leaders who have that old model, but there are lots of them out there that still maintain that, to spare the rod, spoil the child, or spare the rod, spoil the employee,
Oh, Ron, so listen, I can talk about this all day, and you are obviously very fascinating, and your research just covers so many great things. Many times when we have people on this podcast, you said it yourself that being a leader in a field, it doesn't happen alone. So who would you consider some of your biggest mentors that you've had as you came up in this?
I've had so many just unbelievable mentors, and it's really hard. My first mentor was my dissertation advisor, Howard Friedman, and we still work together and keep in touch, and he's terrific. Bernie Bass was a wonderful mentor who's a famous leadership scholar. But the other thing too is mentoring kind of for me works both ways. So I learn as much from the people I'm mentoring as they probably do from me. And so when I think about this is my 45th year of teaching. And when I think about, I'm so proud of the accomplishments of some of my students.
Yeah.
One of my undergraduate students from 20 some years ago, I have a textbook in industrial organizational psychology. And I called her up and I said, she's now a professor. And I said, would you be interested in co-authoring that book? I'm getting up in years and I need somebody to help me out with it. And she jumped at the possibility. She is amazing. She is a better psychologist than I am. And so, that is the great pleasure. Just like I'm so proud of my kids, I'm proud of the accomplishments that my former students have done and what I've learned from them over the years. So I think the mentoring goes both ways.
I love that. I just had this experience recently. I've had the privilege of becoming a professor of social engineering at University of Arizona. And one of my very first lessons is talking about morals and ethics in this field, because it's easy when you're playing the bad guy to forget that you're supposed to be moral and ethical because you're not the bad guy. You're just playing one. And I do my whole first session with the students is all about that. And then I get to read a paper they write on how to apply that to social engineering. And I sat there 2 weeks ago reading this, just like, wow, look at the things they got from that lesson. And they're applying this to our work, and they're talking about how to be moral and ethical. And it made made my heart full, to see that here was a group of people who literally got it. They got it. And what they were writing was like, hey man, they're going to go out and do this job and they're going to do it great.
Yeah. And that's what you want, right? You want better things for the people that come after you, if you've got your moral compass going.
Yeah. Obviously, you're a reader. I can tell by your backdrop. So, and it doesn't even be about the topic we spoke about, but our listeners love to read books. So do you have one, two, or any kind of books that you think you would you need to read this? This is a life-changing book.
The very best book on social psychology is Influence by Robert Cialdini.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And you know that book. And I recommend that in every class I teach. And I always tell the students, if you want to continue psychology, you're not going to take another class. If there's one book to read, it's Cialdini's, because he does such a good job of laying out the foundations of why people can be duped, why they can be fooled by skilled, as he calls them, influence peddlers, people who are experts at persuasion. So that's one. Another great book is James McGregor Burns' book called Leadership, and it's older, 1978. But he lays out and uses political examples of leaders. FDR is one of the people he studies, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and talks about transformational leaders who really transformed society and politics in big ways, and that's a really great book too. So, those are a couple of things. I mean, I guess one of the things that I'll tell you about is the book that this was my COVID project, so I was pretty much locked down teaching online, and what I started to do was I wrote a book for my students, because they take my leadership courses and then they graduate. And I think, gosh, they need to continue their development, because one of the things we do in my courses is we don't just learn about leadership, but we actually try to develop our own leadership capacity to develop the students. And so I wrote a book called Daily Leadership Development. And the idea is that what can you do 10 minutes or 15 minutes every day, a short reading, so they're just one page, 365 of them. And there's a principle about leadership. And it goes in themes, so week by week. So transformational leadership, I think, takes 2 weeks to cover, because it's a very complex theory. I talk about how to develop communication skills, how to develop emotional skills, social skill, all that. advanced leadership techniques. But the idea is for you, if you can spend 10 or 15 minutes, keep it by your bedside, 10 or 15 minutes each day. And then at the end of the brief reading, there is something to try that day to sort of develop your leadership to practice.
I love that.
Yeah, so I give it to my students when they graduate. I self-publish the book, so
yeah, but that's great. What a great tool to have. I have this friend, Robin Dreek, he's used to be with the FBI, and he wrote a book on rapport. Very similar, very small book that just has quick lessons. Yeah. And that's what I told him. That's my favorite book that he wrote, because I can go and digest a few pages and then go try something. Yeah. And I find that for me teaches me so much more when I can read something and then go try it right away. So I love that concept.
Yeah. So this is a year's worth or perhaps more, but that's the idea. I just wanted them to have something that they could reflect back on, or if they really want to develop their leadership, they can intensely get into the book and do it as a course.
So if people wanted to learn more about you and your work and things, where can they go to find out more about what you're doing?
Okay, so I created a website around the book. It's one word, riggioleadership.org. And so that's the one that kind of supports the book. And there's a couple of tools there and some links, and I try to put up some blog posts and things like that. But I'm pretty easy to get a hold of too. I have my website at my college, Claremont McKenna College, and I'm on Twitter. I'm a Psychology Today blogger. And it was interesting, Chris, you mentioned you've been doing it since 2009. And I went, wow. And I go, that's the year I started blogging for Psychology Today.
Wow, really?
So, yeah. So a lot of the book was taking some of those blog posts around leadership and incorporating them into the book. So
that's great. Okay, so we'll definitely link to your website, to the book, to the Psychology Today column. Yeah, and I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, I tweet out whenever I put up a new blog post or whatever.
It's great. I mean, honestly, I've been trying to keep these to like 35 to 45 minutes, but I said we're here in an hour because I think it's just fascinating.
Yeah, we did go over it.
Actionable tips are just so useful. So I can't thank you enough for bringing them here today to us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It was great.
No problem.
Time with you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining Ron and I today on the show. Join us next time on the Human Element series, as we'll be with real estate expert David Hill. If you can believe that. What are we going to learn? I can't tell you. We'll find out next month. So talk to you then.